Despite the fact that the genre has been around for a long time, mystery and suspense fiction shows no signs of slowing down. The many forms of the genre are as successful as ever, dominating bestseller lists on a regular basis and extending both around the globe and across a range of media. What is the history of this perennially popular genre, and what are the reasons for its widespread and enduring appeal? Answering the first question will enable us to answer the second. One of the favorite occupations of those people who read or write about mystery and suspense fiction is to argue about the origins of the genre. Some critics claim that the first literary text about mystery and crime can be found in the work of 18th century British Gothic novelists, such as Horace Walpole and his 1764 novel, The Castle of Otranto, or Anne Radcliffe and her 1794 novel, The Mysteries of Udolpho. There is no doubt that mysterious crime and attempts to clear up the mystery both play a significant role in the genre. Proponents of the view that mystery and suspense fiction begins with the Gothic novel often point in particular to William Godwin's 1794 novel, Things as They Are, or The Adventures of Caleb Williams as the origin of the genre. Godwin's title character is a young man who investigates a murder from the past, thus arguably making him a prototype of the detective figure. As a result, he finds himself framed for a crime he did not commit and has to become a fugitive while he attempts to clear his name. The British Gothic novel has quite a strong claim to have originated mystery fiction, but there are other possibilities. Some critics go a little further back to 1747 and stress the influence of a novel entitled Zadig, written by the French novelist Voltaire. Zadig's title character is a handsome young man living in ancient Babylonia. Over the course of the book, he is presented with a number of challenges and has to solve a number of puzzles. He does so successfully, using what to contemporary readers looks very much like detective work. Others looking for the origins of mystery fiction go much further back, some even pointing to stories in the Bible as examples of mysteries, such as the riddle of what happened to the body of Jesus Christ after it was interred. In general, however, the vast majority of critics agree that mystery and suspense fiction is very unusual among literary genres because we can pinpoint its origins precisely. According to critics such as John Irwin, Lee Horsley, Howard Haycraft, and Stephen Knight, the genre began in April 1841 when the 32-year-old Edgar Allan Poe published a story entitled The Murders in the Rue Morgue. Why is Poe's contribution to the genre so central? The basic reason for Poe's enormous influence is that in Rue Morgue and his other two tales of ratiocination, as he called them, The Mystery of Marie Roget and The Purloined Letter, he created so many of the standard elements and devices of mystery and suspense fiction. Here's a short list. His detective, Auguste Dupin, is an eccentric amateur. He has an admiring friend who acts as a sidekick and who chronicles his deeds. Dupin becomes a serious character. Poe uses an urban setting. He fictionalizes a real-life case. He invents the so-called locked room mystery, where the protagonist has to deduce how the murderer managed to escape from the scene of the crime. He presents the mystery as a competition between the detective and the criminal, and perhaps most important of all, Poe's detective figure personifies the confidence that mysterious and puzzling events can be explained through the application of logic and reason. Poe's mystery stories were enormously popular at the time they were published, and they've remained so ever since. This makes them a valuable source of information about the secret formula of mystery and suspense fiction that makes the genre so appealing. Many of the elements first introduced into mystery and suspense fiction by Poe turn up in later examples of the genre, but I must also qualify that statement. One of the interesting things about mystery and suspense fiction is that it's a great example of what it takes for a genre to be long-lasting, popular, and influential. The secret can be summed up in one word: innovation. Although examples of mystery and suspense fiction have a lot in common with each other, over the course of its long history, the genre has undergone a constant process of innovation and change, so that now you have all kinds of stories that in some ways have very little in common with each other and that all come under the heading of mystery fiction. You have classic mystery fiction, most of which consists of whodunits, in which the reader has to deduce the identity of the criminal. Then there's hard-boiled mystery fiction, which tend to focus on the detective as much as the criminal, and which are well known for being violent and bleak. So-called cozy mysteries, on the other hand, have much less violence than their hard-boiled cousins, and often use country houses or villages for their settings, rather than cities. Although the majority of mysteries have 19th or 20th century settings, historical mysteries take their detective protagonists back as far as the Roman era, or medieval times, or the Renaissance, to explore how well the characteristic tropes of the genre travel in time. Unlike most examples of the genre, which tend overwhelmingly to feature white characters, Black, Latino, and Native American mysteries feature characters from other races and ethnicities in order to analyze what foundational concepts such as justice, law, punishment, guilt, and innocence look like from a non-white perspective. Next, we have suspense fiction, which arguably contains no mystery at all, because we know the identity of the criminal from the beginning of the story. Political thrillers, espionage stories, and conspiracy fictions also tend to have much larger casts of characters than other examples of the genre, combined with a fondness for global settings and an interest in contemporary geopolitics that's often entirely absent from traditional types of mysteries. And finally, what we might call experimental mystery and suspense fiction does something different again. Many writers who are best known as authors of literary fiction have been attracted to mystery and suspense fiction. Partly this is because such writers tend to see mystery and suspense fiction as a genre that makes a fetish out of closure, resolution, and certainty, and they want to deconstruct those things. But the other reason experimental writers are attracted to mystery and suspense fiction is because it is a highly self-conscious genre, especially when it comes to how the stories are constructed and put together. In experimental mystery fiction, therefore, we see writers rework traditional understandings of plot, character, clues, and resolution in surprising and enlightening ways. As we can see from this brief survey, there's a type of mystery and suspense fiction for every kind of reader, and the combination of tried and tested elements and new variations on those elements has proved to be a winning formula that has kept generations of readers engaged and enthralled. One consequence of mystery and suspense fiction's variety is that it can be very difficult to generalize accurately about the genre. One sign of this difficulty is the fact that you'll hear some people refer to mystery fiction, some to detective fiction, some to crime fiction, and some to suspense fiction as if they were all interchangeable terms, whereas in fact, they can be quite different from each other. Not all examples of mystery fiction feature a detective figure. And as I mentioned earlier, there are plenty of suspense narratives that feature crimes but not much mystery, as we may know the criminal's identity from the beginning of the story. In my view, the advantage of the term mystery and suspense fiction is its breadth. Even if it's not a whodunit in the accepted sense of the term, we're usually dealing with a story that contains some element of mystery that is meant to challenge and entertain us. Moreover, the presentation and resolution of that mystery is what generates the narrative suspense that keeps us turning the pages. Bearing the genre's variety and long history in mind, can we say that mystery and suspense fiction has an essence? The best way to answer that question is to review briefly the history of the genre from its beginnings in 1841 to the present day. And to do this, I want to return to a comment I made about Edgar Allan Poe a little earlier. Poe's most influential and original contribution to mystery and suspense fiction is his optimism about the ability of logic and reason to solve mysteries. Poe's stories and the later examples of the genre he inaugurated satisfy our desire to understand and interpret the world around us and to have it make sense. In the 18th century Gothic novel tradition I mentioned earlier, the shock and horror associated with the mysterious events described all too often overwhelm the characters and they lose control. In other words, melodrama trumps logic in the Gothic novel. By contrast, Poe's hero, Dupin, is always in control and provides logical explanations for even the most bizarre events. The power of logic is the defining element of mystery and suspense fiction, and the one thing that sets Poe's tales of ratiocination apart from both the earlier Gothic tradition and from Poe's own Gothic tales. Although writers after Poe, such as Wilkie Collins in The Moonstone, Charles Dickens in Bleak House and The Mystery of Edwin Drood, and Anna Catherine Green in The Leavenworth Case, all made significant contributions to the genre, the next great figure in mystery and suspense fiction is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and his famous creation, Sherlock Holmes. Beginning in 1887, with the publication of the novel A Study in Scarlet, Doyle published dozens of short stories and novels featuring his renowned detective. Despite sharing many similarities with Poe's Dupin, Holmes remains a much more influential and well-known character. Why? Partly because Holmes had a much longer life. Whereas Poe only wrote 3 mystery stories, Holmes had a career spanning 30 years, during which time he became a literary institution. But Holmes has also made a deep and lasting impression because Doyle made him such a memorable character. In contrast to Dupin, who's rather abstract and analytical, Holmes has a number of odd character traits and habits that make him stick in the reader's memory. Yet despite the fact that he takes cocaine and shoots at his apartment wall for target practice, Holmes is exactly like Dupin in his faith that the human mind, as long as it's used diligently and logically, can solve any mystery. But there's another important aspect of the Sherlock Holmes stories that both sets them apart from Poe's tales and helps shed more light on the reasons for mystery and suspense fiction's popularity. It's no accident that the first collection of Holmes stories was called The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. As the word adventures implies, these are exciting stories that frequently find Holmes and his friend, Dr. John Watson, in dangerous situations. And yet, these stories contain not just analysis and excitement, but also humor and even elements of romance, such as when Watson meets his future wife in The Sign of 4. In other words, the Holmes stories are hybrid stories. They combine elements from a number of different genres. And this is another very important part of the appeal and popularity of mystery and suspense fiction. Readers can find a variety of literary pleasures in examples of the genre. Holmes's combination of personal eccentricity and the rigorous application of logic became the model for fictional detectives after Conan Doyle, especially in England. This is true of such writers as Freeman Wills Crofts and Dorothy L. Sayers, but it's especially true of possibly the best-known mystery writer of all time, Agatha Christie, who began publishing in the 1920s, just at the end of Doyle's career. Christie is a tremendously influential writer for several reasons. First, she removed the mystery from the city, where it resided with both Poe and Doyle, and moved it to the countryside. Second, going along with that change in setting, Christie developed what came to be called the country house mystery, where a murder is committed in the house by one of a very small circle of suspects, very often by the butler. The popular board game Clue shows the influence of this model. Christie is also the queen of what came to be known as cozy mysteries. Cozy mysteries reject large amounts of violence committed by professional criminals and concentrate instead on one or two murders committed by ordinary people for complex reasons and often using a variety of bizarre murder weapons. It's also in Christie's work, featuring amateur detectives like Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple, that the reader of mystery fiction assumes a new role in the genre. Before Christie, there was a more or less informal sense that authors had a responsibility to provide their readers with all of the clues they needed in order to solve the mystery. But this responsibility became both formalized and more explicit in the puzzle mystery as perfected by Christie and expressed in the idea of fair play. On the one hand, readers expected that Christie and her fellow mystery writers would not only challenge them by presenting them with a puzzling mystery, but also try and lead them astray by planting false clues or red herrings in the plot. But on the other hand, the reader expected that the author wouldn't do anything grossly unfair, such as making the murderer a character that we've never seen before. The popularity of this type of mystery fiction and the pleasure we derive from it comes from this informal contract between the author and the reader, a contract that implies a knowledgeable reader aware of the genre's conventions and eager to pit their wits against those of the author in an intellectual game. Unfortunately, the cozy mystery epitomized by Christie's work, and to some extent Christie herself, eventually became victims of their own success. As the ingredients that made up the cozy mystery became more established, they also became more rigid and restrictive. Both writers and readers began to feel that the Christie tradition was not only too narrow, but also increasingly irrelevant in a modern world. A backlash was inevitable, and we should not be surprised that it came from America, where the country house mystery was even more irrelevant than it was in England. The roots of the backlash can be found in the development of what were called pulp magazines. These began to appear in the late 19th century, but their boom period occurred roughly between 1920 and 1940. Selling for a dime, these magazines were filled with action-packed stories featuring every kind of detective. But the major contribution of the pulps to the mystery genre was the private eye. The tough private investigator was born in the 1920s in the most famous of the pulp magazines, Black Mask. Black Mask is where writers such as Dashiell Hammett began publishing stories that often featured his nameless operative for the Continental Detective Agency. And this is also the point in the genre's history where it arguably becomes more accurate to use the term crime fiction rather than mystery fiction, because Hammett's tales were not really whodunits, but rather adventure stories organized around a crime. Over time, the kind of fiction published in these magazines by writers like Hammett, Raymond Chandler, Carol John Daly, Raoul Whitfield, and Earl Stanley Gardner came to be known as either noir fiction or hard-boiled crime fiction. What differentiated hard-boiled crime fiction from what came before it? The short answer is everything. The settings left the countryside behind and moved back to the city. The villains were no longer amateurs but ruthless professionals. The murder weapons were usually guns or fists, rather than tropical poisons or ornate jeweled daggers. And the detectives relied not on reasoning to get the job done, but on the same things the criminals used, guns and fists. That last point bears more careful consideration. As I said earlier, Poe, Doyle, and Christie all believed in the power of the human mind to resolve apparently inexplicable mysteries. With the arrival of hard-boiled crime fiction, that optimism and faith disappear. The earlier writers believed that one could solve even bizarre crimes through logic and reason. They also believe that once the detective has solved the crime, society returns to its normal, peaceful state. Hard-boiled writers and their detectives, on the other hand, don't believe that logic and reason get the job done. They rely far more on violence, physical stamina, the willingness to get beaten up repeatedly, and a plentiful supply of cigarettes and whiskey in order to solve a crime. Furthermore, hard-boiled writers believe that even if you do manage to solve one crime, you have to move straight on to another, and then another, and then another, because crime, corruption, and evil are everywhere, and we're all fighting a losing battle against them. This deep-seated pessimism about whether you can really ever solve a crime, and if you can, what difference that makes, is a very modern point of view, and it shows the gulf that separates writers like Poe from writers such as Hammett and Raymond Chandler. What is the appeal of this type of mystery fiction to the reader? In a word, realism. In his landmark 1944 essay, The Simple Art of Murder, Raymond Chandler dismisses the British tradition of the puzzle mystery as disconnected from reality, a prisoner of its own absurd conventions, and with no connection to the world as it actually exists. Chandler then goes on to argue, with the example of Dashiell Hammett in mind, that American crime writing portrays the world as it is, not as we would like it to be, and that it should be valued for this reason. Chandler also singles out the figure of the private eye for special praise, presenting him as the embodiment of morality, ethics, and values in a world where such concepts are increasingly under attack. Chandler's essay helps us understand that hard-boiled mysteries appeal to the reader both because of their unvarnished, realistic cynicism, but also because their private eye protagonists embody an alternative to that cynicism, an oasis of personal responsibility and integrity in a world that is sorely in need of both. In doing so, they remind us that one of the reasons for the enduring popularity of hard-boiled mysteries is that we can use them as a window into the society in which we live, and as a way to gain knowledge about those parts of society that we have no wish to experience firsthand, but that examples of the genre can tell us about from a safe distance. It's also worth emphasizing that hard-boiled mystery fiction is a good example of a feature of mysteries in general that I mentioned earlier, their fondness for innovation. Even though many people assume that mystery and suspense fiction is hidebound by convention, hard-boiled mysteries in particular have proved to be remarkably flexible and very responsive to larger changes taking place in society as a whole. As the racism often found in early examples of hard-boiled crime fiction became both outdated and increasingly unacceptable in the era of the Civil Rights Movement, we start to see the emergence of the black hard-boiled mystery. The work of writers such as Chester Himes and Walter Mosley features black protagonists and settings such as Harlem and South Central Los Angeles. Similarly, if mystery and suspense fiction's portrayal of women has often been either demeaning or rather limited, for the most part confining women to being either victims or femme fatales, in recent years we've seen the rise of strong female protagonists, as in the work of Sarah Paretsky, whose series of novels featuring the female private investigator V.I. Warshawski and Patricia Cornwell, the author of a best-selling series of novels featuring medical examiner Dr. K. Scarpetta. Apart from updating who plays a leading role in mystery and suspense fiction, and how they're represented, Another reason the genre has remained both popular and influential is the way it encourages us to think in detail about how stories are told and why they're constructed in the way they are. In other words, mystery fiction foregrounds issues of narration, point of view, plot construction, character, and narrative resolution. For all of these reasons, as I indicated earlier, mystery fiction has also been very popular among writers of experimental fiction, as in the work of Paul Auster, and in particular his New York trilogy, which is a brilliant critique and reworking of the conventions of the genre as they've been developed ever since Poe. The most recent development in the history of mystery and suspense fiction is also a particularly dramatic example of its popularity and the reasons for that popularity, namely its international spread across the globe. Today, there's more international crime fiction available in translation than ever before, with the work of the so-called Nordic noir novelists, including writers such as Stieg Larsson, Henning Mankell, Karen Fossum, and Camilla Lackberg being especially popular. The spread of British and American mystery and suspense fiction traditions all over the world has given the genre a golden opportunity to expand and innovate both geographically and thematically. The response from readers of the genre has been overwhelmingly positive, largely because these novels give us the opportunity to go on what amounts to a virtual world tour from the comfort of our armchairs, teaching us a huge amount about other cultures because, as every fan of the genre knows, few things give us a better view into a society's values, its successes and failures, than crime. Despite the enormous variety of mystery and suspense fiction, however, I want to conclude this lecture by reiterating what, at a fundamental level, all examples of the genre have in common with each other. This is what I've referred to as the secret formula of mystery and suspense fiction. To that end, the following list of points can be very helpful in clarifying what kind of mystery and suspense fiction one is dealing with at any given moment and how it differs from other examples of the genre. First, identify the level of optimism about the power of logic and reason to solve mysteries. Are we dealing with the confident logicians of classical mystery or the cynics of the hard-boiled type? Or is there even a mystery to be solved at all? Second, what methods do the main characters use to solve mysteries? Do they incline more towards mental analysis or physical violence? Third, who are the villains? Are they professional criminals or ordinary people who will probably murder once and then recede into anonymity? Fourth, what's the relationship between the main characters and the police? If we're reading a police procedural in which members of law enforcement are the protagonists, more likely than not, we'll receive a fairly sympathetic portrayal of the police. In many other examples of the genre, however, it's more or less axiomatic that the protagonists of detective fiction feel hostile towards the police, but the degree of hostility and the reasons for it vary widely. Fifth, why are the main characters in the business of solving mysteries in the first place? Is it a hobby that they pursue out of more or less idle curiosity? A vocation that they follow because of a passionate belief in the principle of justice? Or a job, a way of paying the bills? Being paid to solve mysteries can be a very different thing from doing it out of love for the art of analysis. This difference can tell us a lot about whether we're reading a puzzle mystery, for example, or whether we're in the company of law enforcement personnel. And the sixth and final question, judging from the book or story we're reading, what can we deduce about the society and time period in which the author lived? One of the main reasons for the enduring popularity of mystery and suspense fiction is the way in which these tales give us an opportunity to travel through time and space, in the process learning much about the values of both our own culture and those of others. In this series of lectures, all of these questions will come into play. They will help us explore both the many different varieties of the genre and the techniques they use to entertain and enlighten readers. Thanks to mystery and suspense fiction's variety and continued innovativeness, I can say with confidence that the genre is likely to remain popular with readers for the foreseeable future.